Today we're going to give you some insights on Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. First, let's look at the author. Harper Lee was born in Monroeville, Alabama on April 28, 1926. Nell Harper Lee was the youngest of 3 children. Now, Lee's father and older sister both practiced law in much the same way that Atticus practices law. Her family is also related to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, a man especially noted for his devotion to honor. Now, Harper Lee received her early education in the Monroeville public schools, but she later attended the University of Alabama to study law. But she left after a year to go to England. So a lot of people ask why Harper Lee has written To Kill a Mockingbird, which was an instant success. It's an instant American classic novel, but she didn't write again. Why? Well, Lee never wrote another novel, although she planned to write a series of them in which she would somehow preserve what is beautiful about small-town, middle-class Southern life. She gave an interview on the subject in 1964 to Roy Newquist on this subject, so we are sure she did have plans to write again. Now, in his February 5, 2006 article, Mockingbird author steps out of the shadows, The Observer's Paul Harris stated, "The instant success terrified Lee. In one of her few detailed interviews, given in 1964 to author Roy Newquist, she offered an insight into the impact of instant fame for someone who had been seen as a sidekick to the more glamorous Truman Capote. I sort of hoped someone would like it enough to give me encouragement. I hoped for a little, but I got rather a whole lot. And in some ways, this was just about as frightening as the quick, merciful death I'd expected," she said. Now, what was To Kill a Mockingbird's reception? Well, the novel was actually an expanded version of a short story that Harper Lee had started, and it was on the bestsellers list for more than 80 weeks. Now remember, there are 52 weeks in a year. In April 1961, Harper Lee was awarded the Alabama Library Association Award, and in May, she was the first woman since 1942 to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Well, let's start talking about the book. The setting. Well, the setting is the time and the place in which a story is set, and while physical setting is plainly revealed in the initial chapter's exposition, the social and emotional settings are not explicitly stated, but can be inferred from the action and the dialogue as you continue reading the story. So what does a physical setting include, and what is in To Kill a Mockingbird? Well, the physical setting is the region, the climate, maybe even the physical buildings, or the size of the location. Now, in To Kill a Mockingbird, the general physical setting is the South, a small southern Alabama town. And then, of course, 5 main settings follow. So when we look at the main physical settings, we're in and around the Finch household. We're in and around Boo Radley's house. We're on the school grounds because your main characters are children. You're downtown and around the courthouse and the jail because we also have Atticus Finch, who is a lawyer. And we are also around the Robinson house. Now, these settings relate to the themes about family, superstition and fear, education, justice, and prejudice. When we look at setting as a physical time and place, we also have the social and emotional settings. Now, the social setting is closely related to, and it's perhaps the product of, the physical setting. A social setting is not stated explicitly, but it is developed throughout the novel. Now, the chief element of the social setting here is kind of a caste system of Maycomb, where you have racial prejudice and with the role of women before the 1960s in the United States. It is important to note occasions when members of different castes meet. Social setting is tied to themes of racial prejudice, of boundaries, and of injustice. So when we look at the time period that's supposed to be covering, it's the Southern society in the 1930s. And at that point in time when the story takes place, African Americans often worked for white landowners as field hands or in the town dwelling as servants or maybe perhaps sharecroppers of their own rights, but paying a lot of money to farm. Now, sharecroppers were freed slaves who stayed on the farm on a chunk of land on the plantation that they had been slaved upon, but this time for a share of the profits. Unfortunately, a lot of the landowners cheated the former slaves to the extent that at the end of the year, many former slaves were actually indebted to their former owners, who then turned them into the police for bad debt. The result? Well, unfortunately, the sharecroppers would be arrested and released to the landowner to now work on the land to pay their debts, essentially working for free. We also see discriminatory laws, segregation, and a strict social code that is governed by the interactions between the races. Sometimes referred to as Jim Crow laws, these laws influenced the ways African Americans lived and interacted with whites. Some examples of Jim Crow laws included separate drinking fountains and restrooms. Races sat in different parts of buses. We would see different races attend separate schools. Interracial marriage was considered illegal. All of these different local laws were allowed and emboldened by the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1897 and was not righted until in 1957 with the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. So we do have a little bit of legalese that we have to take into consideration with our social setting. Now, the 13th Amendment, passed in the time of Abraham Lincoln, put into the Constitution, prohibits the slavery of a person. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution, that came shortly after the American Civil War, promises all native-born Americans citizenship, equal protection under the law, due process, and the course of judicial proceeding designed to protect an individual's rights. Now, these amendments were considered very American and were supposed to ensure that African American citizens have a fair trial. However, there were people who were denied a trial by jury because potential jurors can be struck or eliminated from a list of candidates in the process called voir dire. They could also be excused or freed from their obligation to serve because it will cause an undue hardship. Now, the foreman in the court is chosen to speak with the judge on behalf of the jury and delivers the verdict, their vote on guilt or innocence. And after that, either way, either lawyer can appeal the case, take the case to a higher court, and attempt to reverse the decision of a lower court. So even though the federal government passed amendments to give people due process, there's a lot of local government and local civics officers that could bend the rules. Because quite a bit of To Kill a Mockingbird is in the courtroom, there's probably a few legalese definitions we might need to go through. For example, a defendant is the accused person who's been put on trial. The counsel for the defense is the defendant's lawyer. The prosecutor is the opposite lawyer. He's the lawyer in charge of initiating the trial, and he represents the person who is accusing, or he represents the state. The grand jury is a group of people who decide whether a case warrants a trial. And there are witnesses in a trial, people who tell what they know or give testimony about the facts of a case. The judge is the person who presides over the courtroom, the one who makes sure that all the laws are held and abided by. And a plaintiff, the accuser in the case, is represented by the prosecutor. Now, African Americans were not considered for jury duty in many places, especially in the South in the 1930s, and in some cases, they weren't even provided with legal representation or a lawyer. In fact, many whites administered justice to accused African American citizens themselves, and lynchings increased dramatically in 1930. For example, in March of 1931, 9 black youths were arrested in Alabama for allegedly raping 2 white women. Now, the jury consisted of only white men, and all 9 Scottsboro boys were found guilty. Now, local Alabamans assembled outside the jail, and they demanded the youths' lynching. Because this was happening at the time in Alabama, we do know that many aspects of the Tom Robinson case written by Harper Lee in the novel are based on the Scottsboro incident. Now, African Americans at the time were supposed to address whites with titles such as Mr. or Mrs. And it was acceptable for whites to call African Americans by their first names, regardless of their age or position. But then we also see, because we're in around 1930, most of the culture you might see otherwise are 1920s culture. Usually the culture from the previous decade is still around. So you're going to be hearing words such as maybe mahjong. We're going to be playing the game in the book. The Charleston, where they talk about the dance. You might also hear about the movie stars Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Rudolph Valentino. We also have very popular authors at that time, such as Ernest Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And of course, the music of the time, it was all about the Gershwins, particularly George and Ira Gershwin. So what was then becoming hot in the 30s? Well, in the 1930s culture, we moved away from mahjong, and now we're playing a lot of bingo. Shirley Temple becomes one of the hot new actresses of the time. And a new dance style is named after Charles Lindbergh, who had flown around the ocean. And so we called that new dance craze the Lindy. We also have another song called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Because the Great Depression is now in full swing. We also have a movie that becomes quite popular towards the end of the 30s, which is Gone with the Wind. And we also have radio becoming part of the 1930s culture. And so a lot of popular radio shows would be known especially by kids. And a lot of kids would have listened to The Lone Ranger, Little Orphan Annie, and The Shadow. Now, because we're set in a small town in Alabama in the 1930s, you're also going to hear some Southern dialect, certain types of words and phrases that perhaps would only be used by people in a small Southern town. For example, if you hear them saying all fired, it means something that is very or something that is extremely. You're using it as an adjective. Your breeches are your pants or your trousers. A lot of times we're going to have incorrect grammar, such as if they say knowed, they actually are saying I knew instead of I knowed. If you see them saying the words po and show, because of their Southern dialect, their Southern accents, they're losing their R's off their words. So po would be a pronunciation of poor, and show would be a pronunciation of sure, and tolerable, you notice the R is missing again, the pronunciation of tolerable. And tolerable means something that's pretty good or at least fair. And sometimes you're going to have people just shortening up their words at the end, like the word totin, which would be a pronunciation of toting, meaning carrying something. We are also going to have some of the African Americans using some of their dialect as well. For example, they're also going to push a lot of their words together and lose some of the sounds, such as for the word chillin', such as the Southern pronunciation of the words children. They also are going to eat a lot of vegetables because they can grow them on their own, and so you're going to see them talk a lot about their collards, which is a variety of greens grown principally in the South. And we also have a crocker sack, which originally was known as a crocus sack or a burlap sack, which is named because the bulbs of crocus flowers were shipped in similar sacks, and they're going to use these sacks for other means and purposes after you plant your crocus flowers. We also have rabbit tobacco down south, which is a name for balsam weed, which is a plant used as a tobacco substitute by children. Now, we have a piece of furniture known as a chifforobe that has a drawer on one half and it has a hanging closet on the other half. So a lot of the older houses don't have closets built in, but you still need a place to put all of your linens and all of your clothing, and so their closet would be known as a chifforobe. Now, we also are going to have allusions to different pieces of artwork, different pieces of literature or music, or other ideals. And so one of them that we have is from Mrs. Dubose, and why Mrs. Dubose behaves differently to Atticus than she does to his children. Well, maybe it's because he's extravagant in his compliments to her, such as her garden being lovely. He compares her front yard to Bellingrath, which is one of the biggest tourist attractions of Alabama. Located southwest of Mobile, the Bessie Morris Bellengrath House and Gardens include over 60 acres and are especially noted for their azaleas and chrysanthemum flowers. And here are some pictures of that lovely place. We also have another allusion by Heck Tate. He uses the biblical expression, "let the dead bury the dead," when he recalls the events surrounding Jem's assault. Now, this is a quotation from the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament of the Bible. One of the scribes then came up and said to Jesus, "Master, I will follow you wherever you go." Another man, one of his disciples, said to him, "Sir, let me go and bury my father first." But Jesus replied, "Follow me and leave the dead to bury their dead." Now, a lot of people might question, why is it called To Kill a Mockingbird? What is a mockingbird? Well, a mockingbird is praised in songs in the poem, and the mockingbird mainly resides in the southern part of the United States. You can see the picture at the top of the page. It is pale gray and white. It's about the size of an average bird, maybe perhaps the size of the American robin. And while its call is a harsh-sounding check, its song is beautiful. So if you hear it actually twittering or whistling its song, it's characterized by a repeated note or a repeated phrase. However, its gift for imitation of other birds when it sings is how it's gotten its name. Next, we'll look at some of the characters that we have in the story. Let's start with Atticus Finch. He is Scout and Jem's father. He is a central figure in the plot. Now, the name Atticus is the English respelling of the Greek word Attikos. Now, this word, meaning an Athenian, was used by an Athenian poet and legal reformer named Solon in his writings, and it ties Atticus to Solon, who was responsible for instituting the democratic laws of Athens. Now, his name then would also refer to the city of Athens, which would imply the sense of learning, of culture, and of heroism. So Atticus is a father both Scout and Jem can love, but they can also respect. They look to him for comfort as a dad and for reasonable advice, knowing that he is a prominent lawyer in the town. So Atticus in our book is going to be a source of strength and of help. He's also respected because people know he recognizes their personal dignity and that he'll fight to protect it. He's going to be our symbol of integrity in the story. And unconsciously, they know that they can count on him to do those things for them that they lack the courage to do for themselves. Next is our character Calpurnia. Now, Calpurnia's name was the third wife of the Roman Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar, and she was noted for her faithfulness. Now, Calpurnia in our book is the Finch family cook, and she's kind of a surrogate mother for the children. That then gives us a link between the black and white worlds of Maycomb, as Calpurnia is an African American. It gives this sense of a dual personality where she's essentially the surrogate mother for the children, but she still is just working as a servant for the family. However, in the Finch family, she's not considered a servant. She's accepted practically as a member of the Finch family. Atticus is not afraid to talk openly in front of her because he knows that she understands her place in the family. And character also suggests a lesson for blacks that both whites and blacks, unfortunately, can be guilty of racism. We also meet Aunt Alexandra. She's going to represent the traditional, which you should read as not necessarily honorable, the traditional values of the South. She's going to represent home and family, heredity, gentility, and a bit of white supremacy. She is a character that does not change throughout the novel, which makes her a static character. Now, this represents the crucial problem of the South, an unwillingness to forsake the false value structure, even in the face of evidence that is meaningless and unjust. We also meet Miss Maudie Atkinson. Now, she's one of the most colorful characters in To Kill a Mockingbird. She's very benevolent and a brave woman who loves floral beauty. So again, we're looking at a character who's so at home with nature And she also seems to be benevolent towards the Finch children, perhaps another type of mother figure. She seems to be the most rational feminine character in the novel. Unfortunately, she's also a small part in the novel. But she is the female role model that Scout most likes and admires. Remember, Scout is your main character. She particularly likes Maudie Atkinson for her willingness to be very direct and honest with her. Now, Mayelle Ewell is another minor character in the story, but plays a very crucial part. Scout describes Bob Ewell's daughter as the loneliest person in the world. She seems to be a victim of circumstances. She's in an abusive family, and she's looking for attention. She's desiring affection, but she's also fearful of her father. Now, like Miss Maudie, she's also closely associated with nature. Now we're going to look at Jeremy Finch. Jeremy is Scout's older brother. We're going to call him Jem throughout the story. He's 10 years old when the story begins and 13 years old at the end. Events of the story parallel his transition from being a child at the age of 10 to growing into a young man at 13. Now, he emerges at the end of his experience completely changed by his contact with the adult world. He's likely the character who you see changing the most during the course of the story. He also becomes more sensitive to the meaning of the happenings around him. He's beginning to realize the themes that the reader is going to be realizing as well. And he develops a compassionate attitude towards Atticus, his father, to Tom, to Boo Radley, and to Mrs. Dubose. We also meet Jean Louise Finch, who is going to be your most important character in the story because she's your narrator. We've viewed the action through her eyes and her opinions about what is happening. Jean Louise is Scout. She's 5 years old at the start and 8 years old at the end of the story. She seems, however, even at that young age, to be above average and intelligent. She's very perceptive at the events that are going on around her, which helps our narration. She seems to have a bit of a temper, though. She's a bit impulsive. Now, two characters who are in reality one person, you do have the grown-up Jean Louise telling us the story. She's doing every bit of the story in a flashback to the little girl Scout, who is actively a part of the story. Now, Jean Louise is recalling what happened to her as a child, and Scout is the child herself going through the motions or the actions. We also meet Charles Barker Harris. He's a character whom the reader might regard as an outside influence. This is Dill Harris, our neighborhood friend. He's not originally from Maycomb, but he's put in the story to basically get a flavor to it. He's very imaginative, he's a very sensitive little kid, and he's been shuffled, unfortunately, from relative to relative, so he seems to be kind of adrift in his life. Our next door neighbor, Arthur Radley, is known as Boo, and he only appears once at the end of the story. He's a shy man who lives in total seclusion, but his real place in the story is more as symbolic. He's an unknown symbol, and when we see him in the end, we have this sense of innocence and the theme of bravery that comes through. He becomes a symbol of kindness as he leaves various things in the tree for the children to find, and then covers Scout with a blanket on the night of Miss Maudie's fire. But because he only comes out at night, because we don't ever really see him until the very end, he's considered almost ghost-like or phantom-like, and that's where we get the name of Boo. Now, the adults would kind of think he's the town freak, but he has a more genuine sense of values and a greater compassion than most of the citizens of Maycomb. The children learn lessons of greater importance from Boo than they do from almost anyone else. They learn to judge him by his actions and not by the town gossip. Next, we'll look at the historical setting, and that includes the dates during which the action takes place and the magical historical events that shape the action. Now, the action of this novel begins in 1932, where we're at the height of the Great Depression in the United States. So the novel is set in the midst of the Great Depression, which began on October 1929, and is considered the worst economic depression in modern times. By 1933, the United States had a 25% unemployment rate. Home loss followed this trend. In contrast, Around September 1995, it'd be about 4.2%, and even in the last Great Recession that the United States had, the rate was only about 8.5. So there's quite a difference between the idea of 8.5% and 25%. So the Great Depression ended in the late 1930s because of the need for war materials at the beginning of World War II, and by government job creation throughout the 1930s. Once people go back to work, money goes back into circulation, and the economy will grow. Now, the man most associated with the economic recovery of the 1930s is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's the 32nd President of the United States, and was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933. In his historic speech, he encouraged Americans to put aside their fears and support his efforts to get America back on track. He once said, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." So we have a couple of terms in our book that we might hear about the Great Depression, where if somebody's gone bust, they are now bankrupt. They have no money. We'll hear the talk of an economic depression, which is a period of drastic decline in the national economy, and it's characterized by decreasing business activity, falling prices, and downright unemployment, where nobody has a job. And then, of course, some people who do have jobs, because we have falling prices, you'll see spending sprees, which is an overindulgence in spending money. You might also hear people talk about stocks, the shares that are sold by a corporation that entitle the holder to benefits of ownership, including dividends. That people may play the market, where they're gambling by using stocks, figuring out which stocks will go up quicker, and you're going to be putting your money into those instead of others. And then goods and services of the economy, the two categories of things that one can purchase. And these two categories make up your economy, or mostly your gross national product. We might also hear about bank failures, when a bank goes bankrupt or becomes unable to meet their debts or discharge its liabilities. A bank failure means the bank doesn't have enough money to go around. The stock market is a stock exchange where stocks are bought and sold according to fixed regulations. And again, the word bankrupt means a legal declaration of your inability to pay off your debts. You can't pay anyone. And then, of course, in the 1930s, a lot of people were on relief. They're looking for aid or help due to need or due to their poverty. Lastly, we'll look at some themes of the book. Now, themes are the universal meanings derived from art. They're usually not stated directly, so to uncover them, you might want to pay attention to a few things. Watch what your characters are learning and what happens to them in the end. Perhaps the title might give away a theme. A lot of symbolism, if you see different symbols being used over and over again with their figurative language. The tone, the imagery, and the details can also give us some themes, and perhaps you'll see some phrases that are repeated. So some themes that are predominant in the novel, you might be seeing the idea of prejudice and the idea of superstition. And when people are prejudiced and superstitious, this can lead to injustice. They will put people down. Individuals have a responsibility to protect the innocent. That idea of bravery or courage in one responsible individual. One person's wrongdoing can release evil into the entire community. It doesn't take much for people to be brought up into something bad. And fear is also going to be another theme. People often fear what they don't understand. Now, the most important parts of a child's education may take place in the home and the community rather than in school. And so a lot of times you're going to see Gem and Scout giving us themes away from the school grounds. Now, insight, maturity, understanding, and integrity really have no necessary relation to age, social position, or formal education, and appearances don't always reflect reality. So don't wait for somebody in power or some adult to give you a theme. Chances are, because this is a coming-of-age novel, you might see Gem and Scout giving us quite a bit of our themes. And that's it for our To Kill a Mockingbird. If you'd like to learn more, want me to go chapter by chapter with Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, please let me know in the comments down below what more you'd like to learn about the book. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed.